On February 14, 1975, a couple driving through rural Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana noticed something hanging amidst the trees. Stopping to investigate, they stumbled upon a tragic scene that would briefly capture national attention. At the base of the tree, they found a glass jar containing a handwritten note addressed to Mom and Dad. The boy carried no identification, and authorities would soon refer to him simply as the Plaquemines Parish John Doe. Investigators recovered the note from the jar and discovered it was a lengthy, introspective message from the boy explaining his decision. He wrote that he felt he had never truly developed into a real person, and that he was living in a false, empty existence he could no longer tolerate. The tone was one of profound despair and detachment. He described having a, quote, pervasive melancholy since birth, and believed he had stopped growing emotionally long ago. In the letter, the young man thanked his parents for all the advantages and support they had given him, but implored them not to blame themselves for what he was about to do. He even urged them to consult a psychiatrist to understand his mindset, suggesting there were aspects of his identity or mental state that he himself struggled to accept. Unusually, the note also included a section addressed to the police, and the boy pleaded with authorities not to pursue his identity. He argued that any investigation would accomplish little except to shatter his parents' peace by confirming their worst fears. In a final wish, he asked to be cremated and buried as a John Doe, so his parents could retain hope that their missing son might one day return instead of knowing he was gone forever. Essentially, this teenager tried to erase his own identity to spare his loved one's pain. The content of the note fascinated the public and investigators alike. It was extremely articulate and philosophical, far beyond what one might expect from someone who may have still been in high school. He even referenced the work of sociologist Emile Durkheim on the subject of the act he was doing, indicating he had studied some intellectual perspectives on his situation. Despite the boy's plea for anonymity, authorities couldn't simply close the case. The Plaquemines Parish Sheriff's Office launched an effort to identify the victim, distributing his physical description and fingerprints nationwide in hopes of matching a missing person. The Associated Press picked up the story of this mystery teen, and newspapers around the country ran articles about the unknown youth with the poignant note. Tips and leads began to flow in, as families of missing sons wondered if this could be their child. Over 300 families contacted law enforcement, and many traveled to Louisiana to view the body at a New Orleans area funeral home. Despite this extensive effort, in the end, every lead and comparison turned up empty. By June 1975, with no identification uncovered, authorities felt they had done all they could. The unknown boy was laid to rest in an unmarked grave at a cemetery in Gretna, Louisiana. His funeral was simple and anonymous, in keeping with his own wishes. After the burial, this John Doe case quickly slipped from the spotlight, becoming yet another unsolved mystery. With no actual crime to investigate, there was little incentive for officials to pursue it further. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina's devastation reportedly destroyed many local records, and the John Doe's case file and the exact location of his burial were lost. In 2022, despite the lost case file, he was finally added to the Name Us database, a repository of John and Jane Doe cases as well as missing people. With his case now on the radar, there remains hope that modern forensic techniques might provide answers eventually. However, without a known DNA sample or an exhumation, identifying him will be challenging. While it's known that he was buried in Gretna, the unfortunate reality is that no one knows exactly where he was laid to rest. While he had requested to be cremated in his note, contemporary reports indicate that this wasn't done. His remains do lay somewhere in that cemetery, though, and if someone is able to remember where he was buried, there is the potential to resolve his case once and for all. Many theories have been proposed to explain who this young man was and why he felt compelled to do what he did. Most believe that he suffered from serious depression or another mental illness that left him feeling numb and isolated. He described himself as living a detached, hollow life without real friendships. Some have speculated that this aligns with severe depression or perhaps even high-functioning autism. Another theory is that he was grappling with issues of identity. Being gay had only been removed from the psychiatric list of disorders a year earlier, in 1974, and prejudice remained extremely strong. It's speculated that he might have been very concerned about the grief this reality would have brought to his parents. His suggestion that his parents see a psychiatrist to understand what was going on with him hints that there was something fundamental about himself that he felt they didn't understand. Another theory suggests that he may have been a first-year university student living far away from home who suffered from a mental break. This could explain why he was quoting Durkheim in his letter, and the upper end of his estimated age range puts him well within the range of being a student. Another theory about who he was centers on the national attention the case received in the wake of his passing. The news articles were very clear that the John Doe really didn't want to be identified. Perhaps his parents were one of the families who came to see his body, and recognizing it was him, didn't identify him to the police. After all, the absolute last thing this young man seems to have wanted was a media circus surrounding himself, given his desire to be buried as a John Doe. Under this theory, his parents quietly made their peace, and fearing the national attention that would be brought by his identification, chose to respect his wishes. And I can see why they may have done this. And after all, identifying him wouldn't have brought him back, and no crime was committed that they needed to get justice for their son. In a tragic irony, the young man achieved his wish to remain a nameless enigma, but paradoxically, this status has since captured the hearts and minds of millions of people. I can relate to that in a huge way, since I had previously very briefly covered his story last year. It was just a very short segment, just about 2 minutes, and I couldn't get his story out of my mind. Every few months since that point, I've gone back and looked to see if there was any breakthroughs in his case. And honestly, I'm gonna keep doing that. Perhaps one day we'll know who he was and why he did what he did, but for now, his story will remain one of the most compelling and heartbreaking John Doe cases I've covered. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and to tap the notification bell and click the share button and send it around to your friends and family. For reasons I don't fully understand, hitting the notification bell is actually way more important these days than hitting the subscribe button. I've had a lot of comments lately about YouTube not pushing my new videos to subscribers, and if you hit the bell, you're way more likely to see my new videos on your homepage. The air over Australia's Bass Strait was perfectly calm on the evening of October 21st, 1978. Visibility was excellent, the winds were light, and a pilot flying high enough could see the beam of the Cape Otway lighthouse cutting through the twilight from miles away. It was, by all accounts, an ideal night for flying. Inside the cockpit of a single-engine Cessna 182L, 20-year-old Frederick Valentich was about an hour into his planned flight from Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne to King Island. At 7:06 p.m., his voice, professional and measured, crackled over the radio to the Melbourne Flight Service Unit. He asked the controller, Steve Roby, a simple, routine question if there was any known air traffic below 5,000 feet. Roby replied that there wasn't. But Valentich insisted there was something there. He could see something. He described 4 bright lights, like landing lights, on what he thought was a large aircraft. He said that it had just passed about 1,000 feet above him at an incredible speed. Over the next 6 minutes, a routine flight spiraled into one of aviation's most profound and enduring unsolved mysteries. The conversation that unfolded between the lone pilot and the ground controller was one of escalating strangeness. Valentich reported that the object was now approaching him from the east. His tone wasn't one of outright panic, but of genuine, deepening confusion. He suggested the other pilot was playing around with him, orbiting him 2 or 3 times at speeds he couldn't identify. Roby, unable to see anything on his radar, pressed for details. Valentich struggled to provide them. He described the object as a long shape with a shiny metallic surface and a green light on it. At one point, he reported that the object had simply vanished, only to reappear moments later from a different direction. Then came the most unsettling part of the transmission. Valentich stated that his plane's engine was beginning to run rough. He told Roby his intention was still to fly to King Island, but his focus was on the object now hovering directly above him. Roby asked him once more to identify the craft. Valentich's final chilling words were, quote, "It's hovering and it's not an aircraft." Following that declaration, his microphone remained open, while bizarre noises came through. Then there was nothing but absolute silence, and Frederick Valentich had vanished, never to be seen again. Frederick Valentich was, by all accounts, consumed by a passion for aviation. He was a member of the Royal Australian Air Force's Air Training Corps and was absolutely determined to build a career as a pilot. Aviation was his central ambition in life, but his dream was proving difficult to achieve. He had applied to enlist as a military pilot twice, but was rejected both times due to inadequate educational qualifications. Undeterred, he pursued a commercial pilot's license as a civilian, but his academic struggles continued. He had a poor achievement record, having failed all 5 of his commercial license examination subjects on 2 separate occasions. Just a month before his disappearance, he had failed 3 of those subjects for a 3rd time. His record also included several questionable flying incidents. He had been formally warned for straying into a controlled zone in Sydney and had twice deliberately flown into clouds. This cloud issue was an infraction for which authorities were reportedly considering prosecution since he just kept doing it. This paints a picture of a young pilot whose confidence may have significantly outpaced his proven competence. It also shows that he was someone who might be prone to taking risks for no real apparent reason. Adding another critical layer to his psychological profile was a deep personal interest. According to his dad, Frederick was an ardent believer in extraterrestrials and had expressed concerns about being attacked by them. While it appears to be undoubted that he believed in them, some have questioned whether he really believed that he would come under assault. This pre-existing belief system provides a powerful lens through which his final, terrifying report can be interpreted. The flight plan itself had some pretty severe inconsistencies from the very beginning. The aircraft was a reliable workhorse of a plane, and it had just passed a 100-hour inspection with flying colors. Curiously, Frederick had filled its tanks with enough gas for 300 minutes of flight, a fact that would fuel significant speculation on this case. And I'm just going to pause there for a second, because I didn't realize what I had written there until I was recording. Anyway, this fuel gave him 500 miles of range, when he only needed 150 miles of range to get to King Island and back. The flight plan he filed was straightforward. Depart Moorabbin, fly west over Cape Otway, then turn south across the Bass Strait to King Island. The mystery lay not in the plan, but in its purpose. Valentich provided conflicting and ultimately false reasons for his journey. He told flight officials he was going to pick up friends, even taking 4 life jackets with him. He told his family and girlfriend he was going to collect crayfish. Investigations later confirmed that no one was waiting for him on King Island, and there were no crayfish to be had. The most glaring anomaly was a critical procedural failure. For any pilot intending to land at an uncontrolled airstrip like King Island's at night, it was standard and necessary procedure to call ahead and arrange for the runway lights to be turned on. Valentich never made that call, and this omission, combined with having way too much fuel, strongly suggests that he never actually intended to land on King Island. The destination seems to have been a fiction, a cover for a flight with a different, unknown purpose. That said, there were clearly some competency issues with Frederick's flying ability, so it is always possible that he simply forgot to make this critical call to the airstrip in advance. He also seems like he was more than a bit of a cowboy in the cockpit, so he may have simply wanted to attempt a more dangerous landing. This case has been highly controversial, and there's been numerous theories to explain what happened to Frederick, ranging from down to earth to out of this world. The most widely accepted conventional explanation centers on a deadly phenomenon known as spatial disorientation. Flying over a featureless body of water at dusk, with the horizon blurring into darkness, can trick a pilot's senses. An inexperienced and perhaps incompetent pilot could easily lose their sense of which way is up. In this state, the aircraft's own lights reflecting off the calm water below could appear as another craft maneuvering beneath him. Alternatively, the 4 bright lights he reported could have been a conjunction of the planets Venus, Mars, and Mercury, along with the bright star Antares. To a disoriented pilot, these stationary celestial bodies could create the powerful illusion of an object pacing his aircraft. If he began to circle, as he reported he was doing, the planets would appear to be orbiting him. Distracted and trusting his faulty senses over his instruments, he could have inadvertently put the Cessna into what's known as a graveyard spiral. This is a tightening, descending turn that becomes unrecoverable, leading to a high-speed impact with the water. Another set of theories looks not to the sky, but to Valentich's state of mind. His lifelong dream of a career in aviation was clearly stalling out in a major way. He wanted to be an aerial ace, and his chances of becoming a military pilot were completely shot. His chances of becoming a commercial pilot were also rapidly dwindling. The repeated exam failures and the looming threat of prosecution for his flying infractions represented significant psychological blows. Even if he was able to pass his tests, he would essentially be an uninsurable risk and wouldn't be able to get hired regardless. His girlfriend would later tell investigators that he was acting very unusually the night before the flight. This has led to speculation that the flight was a premeditated act. Perhaps he staged his own disappearance, using the Cessna's long-range fuel capacity to fly to a remote location and start a new life under a new identity. The elaborate story would have been the perfect cover to fly away and start new somewhere else. Of course, there's a more tragic version of this theory which suggests the flight was a way to leave behind his friends and family without the grief associated with an intentional act. The flight's lack of any legitimate purpose and his failure to arrange for landing lights lend credence to the idea that this was a one-way trip. However, his family and friends have always been adamant that he wouldn't have done this and was looking forward to the future. The third possibility is to take Frederick Valentich at his word. This theory claims that he was describing a real event as it happened. His report was detailed, his descriptions of the object's movements were specific, and his tone was one of genuine bewilderment rather than fabricated panic. This theory is bolstered by a number of belated eyewitness accounts from the ground. After the story hit the newspapers, several people came forward claiming to have seen strange, erratically moving green lights in the sky over the Bass Strait that same night. An amateur photographer named Roy Manifold was taking pictures of the sunset at Cape Otway around the time of the incident. I've put the Roy Manifold photograph up on the screen now, so if you're one of those people who just listens, take a look and tell me what you think this is. In the immediate aftermath, a massive 4-day air and sea search was launched, covering more than 1,000 square miles of ocean. Searchers found nothing. No wreckage, no personal effects, not even an oil slick that could be positively identified as coming from his Cessna. It was as if the pilot and his plane had simply been erased from existence. The Australian Department of Transport conducted a thorough investigation, but was ultimately unable to determine a cause. The official file was closed with the verdict, presumed fatal, for Valentich, leaving the case officially unresolved. For 5 years, the mystery hung in the air, fueled only by speculation and the haunting radio transcript. Then, in 1983, a piece of physical evidence finally surfaced. A piece of an engine was found washed ashore on an island hundreds of miles away. The Bureau of Air Safety Investigation confirmed that the part came from a Cessna 182, but was unable to determine if it specifically came from Valentich's aircraft. In the end, no one can say for sure what happened to Frederick Valentich, which is perhaps why his case remains so well known and widely discussed until this day. If you're a regular viewer, you know I don't usually ask this, but I'd definitely like to hear which theory you prefer in the comments below. I know there's also a bunch of theories out there on this one that I didn't touch on, but that's just because the lack of certainty gives theorists ample room for speculation. In late October 2004, construction workers clearing an old racetrack in New Jersey made a grim discovery: the skeletal remains of a young woman. The location was the former Malibu Grand Prix go-kart track in Mount Laurel, Burlington County, a once bustling entertainment center abandoned for years. To this day, the victim's identity remains unknown, and she is remembered only as the Burlington County Jane Doe. Now, over 2 decades later, a cutting-edge DNA breakthrough revealing Turkic ancestry has injected new hope into this cold case. On October 26, 2004, an excavation crew was demolishing structures at the Malibu Grand Prix site when they stumbled upon human remains in a wooded area off Fellowship Road. The property, once a go-kart racing park with arcades, had sat vacant for the previous 6 years. Hidden among overgrown brush and debris lay the skeletal remains of a female, later estimated to have been deceased for roughly 1 year. Cops believe she likely died in early 2003, meaning her remains had quietly weathered at least a full cycle of seasons before discovery. Investigators immediately treated the scene with suspicion, and finding a body in such a secluded, out-of-the-way spot suggested foul play. The woman carried no identification, and there were no obvious personal documents or cell phone, only the tattered remnants of her clothing, and a few mundane items. The Burlington County medical examiner couldn't initially determine the cause of her demise, and no significant clues were recovered. With no ID and no immediate missing person match, the case began as a perplexing Jane Doe investigation. Although her name was a mystery, investigators did gather valuable details about the unidentified woman. She was between 25 and 35 years old and stood 5 feet 5 inches tall. She weighed somewhere between 100 to 125 pounds in life, though this was just a rough estimate given the state of her remains. Her hair was black, and she likely had black or brown eyes, and she was initially believed to be half white and half Asian, though some suggested that she could be Native American. No evidence of trauma has ever been publicly disclosed, though the location of her body indicated that she was likely dumped there. While this could theoretically suggest an accidental overdose, the far more probable cause, according to investigators, was foul play. The Burlington County Jane Doe case soon went cold, as leads proved extremely elusive. Given her background, it was relatively easy to rule out missing individuals, but this didn't lead detectives to a match. She had some features that could cross ethnic categories, and as it would turn out, she would come from a background that's fairly rare in America. For years, the New Jersey State Police Cold Case Unit periodically revisited the file. They circulated a forensic sketch of the woman's face in hopes someone would recognize her, but no one ever did. Fast forward to 2025, nearly 21 years after her passing, and science finally cracked open a new avenue. Forensic specialists managed to extract a usable profile from the Jane Doe's remains after multiple earlier attempts had failed. Astria Forensics, a California-based lab, performed advanced DNA extraction and sequencing on the degraded samples, achieving a genealogy-ready profile. This genetic profile didn't end up leading to a match, but it revealed something fundamental about her. The Burlington County Jane Doe's DNA indicated that she was of Central Eurasian descent, specifically of the Turkic ethnic group. In other words, her closest genetic relatives, the very distant cousins showing up in databases, traced to populations from countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. Of course, when a Jane Doe shows up with both Asian and European features, investigators never jump to the conclusion of, well, she must have been Kazakh. It suddenly made sense why no local missing persons report matched her, despite her distinctive background. She may not have originally been from the United States at all, and may have had no family or friends to report her missing. The Ramapo College of New Jersey's Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center worked with state police to determine next steps. In September 2025, they went public with the new information, hoping it might reach someone who recognizes the description. They even created a fresh outreach campaign, encouraging her sketch to be shared around Turkic community groups, both in the States and abroad. With the evidence available, several theories have emerged about the Burlington County Jane Doe's life and tragic end. One theory is that she may have been a recent immigrant or foreign national who came to New Jersey not long before her passing. Given her Central Asian ancestry, she could have moved to America for work, study, or for marriage. If so, it's possible that no local authorities were aware she was missing because her family might be overseas. Language barriers or immigration status could have prevented a timely missing persons report. Tragically, if she had few friends or contacts here, her disappearance might have gone nearly unnoticed by anyone. Another theory suggests that she may have been a tourist who was traveling solo in the United States. Some have theorized that she could have been on a tour of the entire country, and that her friends and family back home may not have known where she was when she disappeared. Without knowing where exactly she was traveling, and faced with a language barrier, there may have been no way to meaningfully report her missing. Another troubling possibility is that she was a victim of trafficking or foul play by someone she met after arriving in America. The early 2000s saw cases of trafficking rings from former Soviet states, and one of the claims is that the Jane Doe could have been caught in such a situation. Perhaps she trusted the wrong person, such as an employer, a quote-unquote boyfriend, or a smuggler who harmed her and dumped her body behind the abandoned racetrack. The Malibu Grand Prix site, being deserted, would have been a convenient hiding place for a crime. Supporting this theory is the fact that her personal items were minimal and she was devoid of any identification, almost as if someone deliberately stripped her of anything traceable. It's easy to imagine a scenario where an assailant removed her wallet or papers to delay identification. If she was the victim of trafficking, it's been speculated that she's much less likely to be Kazakh or Azeri, rather than Kyrgyz or Uzbek. This is due to the socio-economic realities of these nations. While Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan are upper-middle-income nations, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan are quite poor, making women from these countries more likely to be targeted. A more domestic theory speculates that the woman could have been American. While individuals of her background aren't overly common in the United States, they did first start arriving in the 19th century, along with other immigrants from the Russian Empire. Some have speculated that she may actually be a Tatar, a Turkic Eurasian ethnic group found throughout Russia and Eastern Europe. Tatars often express traits from their combined European and Asian heritage, which may explain the Burlington Jane Doe's appearance and genetic results. And interestingly, while going down the rabbit hole on the presence of Tatar people in America, I found out that the iconic all-American actor Charles Bronson was half Tatar. I'm sure that'll come in handy for someone watching at a bar trivia night someday. Ultimately, at present, this Jane Doe still doesn't have her name back, but with this new piece of evidence, her case may be resolved soon. In the Fisherville neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky, there's a place where the serene beauty of nature collides with a dark legend. Pope Lick Creek is an idyllic slice of the Kentucky landscape, with hiking trails that wind through old-growth forests and meadows that bloom with wild flowers. But looming over it all is a skeletal finger of rusted steel, a 90-foot-high, 800-foot-long railroad trestle, owned and operated by Norfolk Southern Railway. This bridge is the stage for one of America's most unsettling legends, the tale of the Pope Lick Monster. For generations, stories have been whispered about a creature that haunts this spot, a grotesque hybrid of man and goat, or perhaps man and sheep. But the truly chilling part of this story isn't the monster. It's the very real, very long list of people who have perished here, lured to their doom not by a cryptid's hypnotic gaze, but by the siren song of the legend itself. Locals have described a creature with the muscular torso of a man and the fur-covered legs of a goat, complete with cloven hooves. While the earliest records seem to indicate that the creature was thought to be a sheepman, it morphed from a friendly sheep to the more satanically aligned barnyard animal later. Its face is said to be a pale alabaster mask, with wide-set eyes and sharp horns jutting from its forehead. The stories of its origin are extremely varied. The most popular version claims it was a circus freak, a horribly mistreated creature that escaped when a circus train derailed on the trestle during a violent thunderstorm. Another tale paints it as the twisted reincarnation of a farmer who sacrificed his goats to the devil for dark powers, only to be transformed into the very thing he destroyed. Still others rationalize the legend, suggesting it was just a reclusive hermit or a scientist disfigured in a lab accident who scared people away from the tracks. Whatever the case, the legend is clear that the monster uses hypnosis or mimics human voices to lure trespassers onto the trestle, right into the path of an oncoming train. But the truth is, the trestle needs no actual monster to eliminate its victims, and it's a perfect trap all on its own when combined with the legend. Contrary to a misconception popular among thrill seekers, the tracks aren't abandoned, not even in the slightest. They're a major and frequently used freight artery into Louisville. The bridge has no walkways or railings, just a few feet of uneven railroad ties on either side of the rails before a 9-story drop. The curve of the track and the surrounding woods can muffle the sound of an approaching train until it's too late. Once a train appears, there's no escape to be had unless the train coming is very short, and even then it requires ape-like athletic ability. A person can't outrun the train, and only the most elite grip athletes such as rock climbers possess the strength to hang from the side for the 5 to 7 minutes it takes a long train to pass. For decades, people have come here to test their bravery, and for decades, people have perished. In 1987, 17-year-old Jack Baum was struck by a train while trying to get a glimpse of the Goat Man. In 2016, Raquel Bain, a 26-year-old tourist from Ohio, met her end while searching for the monster with her boyfriend. He only survived by dangling precariously from the side of the bridge as the train roared past, and fortunately for him, it was a relatively short train. In 2019, 15-year-old Savannah Bright was struck on the tracks, an incident that led her grieving parents to file a lawsuit against Norfolk Southern. They alleged the company hadn't done enough to secure what had become an attraction, which led to Bright being cut down by the train. The very unsettling thing about the Pope-Lick monster is that it's a terrifying example of a cautionary tale that has become pathological. The purpose of the legend was presumably originally to scare teenagers away from going to this extremely dangerous train crossing. If it stayed like that, it would have been a localized version of the Hookman, a common urban legend which advises teenagers to stay away from secluded lovers' lanes. But the legend of the Goatman does the opposite. It doesn't warn people away from the trestle, it beckons them closer. The prohibition against crossing the tracks to see the creature somehow transformed from a word of caution into a high-stakes dare that legitimately brings people in from around the world. In that way, the Pope-Lick monster is almost like a Scooby-Doo villain, or at least it would be if it hadn't claimed so many lives. It's February 13th, 1961, and three amateur rockhounds, Wallace Lane, Virginia Maxey, and Mike Mikesell, were out searching for geodes to sell in their small gem and gift shop. After a long morning, they'd gathered a sack full of promising specimens. The next day, back in their workshop, Mikesell fired up his diamond-bladed saw to slice one open, expecting to find beautiful amethyst crystals inside. Instead, the saw screeched, shuddered, and a nearly new blade was utterly destroyed. Inside the rock wasn't the hollow, crystal-lined cavity, but something completely impossible. It was a perfectly circular cylinder of what looks like white porcelain, with a 2-millimeter shaft of bright magnetic metal running through its center. This was the birth of the Koso artifact, an object that would soon become a legend in the world of out-of-place artifacts. The discoverers examined it more closely, finding other strange features. The porcelain was wrapped in a hexagonal casing, and there were layers of what seemed to be decomposing copper. Even stranger, embedded in the outer crust of this hardened, clay-like rock were what looked like a nail and a washer. But the detail that truly ignited the firestorm of speculation came from Virginia Maxey. She claimed that an unnamed geologist had examined fossil shells on the object's surface, and declared that the nodule had taken at least 500,000 years to form. If this was to be believed, what they found was a 500,000-year-old machine-made object. The claim was staggering, and though the geologist was never identified and their findings were never published, the story took on a life of its own. It was supposedly the perfect oopart, a piece of advanced technology where it shouldn't possibly exist. The theories that erupted were as spectacular as the claim itself. For some, this was tangible proof of a lost, hyper-advanced ancient civilization like Atlantis or Mu, a relic of forgotten science. Others looked to the stars, suggesting it was a piece of equipment dropped by prehistoric ancient astronauts during a visit to Earth. A third popular theory proposed it was the result of a time traveler's mishap, a modern device accidentally left behind in the deep past. The artifact also became a celebrated piece of evidence for young Earth creationists. While it seems paradoxical for those who believe in a 6,000-year-old Earth to champion a 500,000-year-old object, their goal wasn't to validate the age. Instead, they used it as a tool to argue that scientific dating methods were fundamentally flawed. If geologists could be so wrong about this rock, they argued, then their dating of everything else must be unreliable too. Interestingly, these young Earth creationists were essentially the first ones to unequivocally be on the side of the final scientific explanation. For decades, the mystery festered, fueled by a few grainy photos and X-rays. The artifact itself vanished from public view, held by Wallace Lane, who refused to let anyone else examine it. But in the late 1990s, a pair of skeptical investigators, Pierre Stromberg and Paul Heinrich, decided to solve the case once and for all. They started with the most basic claim about whether the object was a geode at all, and the answer was disappointing. Geodes have very specific characteristics: a hard outer shell of chalcedony and an inner lining of quartz crystals. The Koso artifact had neither, and its encasing material was soft, with a hardness of only 3 on the Mohs scale. It wasn't a geode, it was a concretion, and this distinction is critical. While geodes take millennia to form, concretions can form rapidly. When an iron or steel object is left in the ground, the process of rusting can cause minerals in the surrounding soil and water to precipitate and cement sediment around it. This forms a hard nodule in a matter of decades, not over the course of untold eons like a geode. The foundation of the mystery, the immense age, had crumbled, but they also wanted to find out what the object actually was. Using the old X-rays that were publicly available, Stromberg and Heinrich had a hunch and reached out to an unusual group of experts, the spark plug collectors of America. The reaction was immediate and unanimous, and the collectors positively identified the object as a 1920s-era Champion spark plug, the kind widely used in Ford Model T vehicles. Suddenly, every mysterious detail clicked into place. The porcelain cylinder was the plug's insulator, and the hexagonal casing was the impression left by the plug's steel hex nut. The case was effectively closed, but the final confirmation came in 2018. Stromberg was contacted by the family of one of the discoverers and was finally able to physically inspect the artifact. A geologist from the University of Washington confirmed it was a simple iron oxide concretion. Importantly, the geologist found no evidence of the fossil shells that had started the 500,000-year-old claim in the first place. The Koso artifact wasn't a relic of Atlantis, a piece of an alien spaceship, or a time traveler's lost tool. It was very literally a piece of trash. Still, the mystery of the Koso artifact isn't entirely resolved at this point, even if the underlying issues all are. Whether the Koso artifact was an intentional hoax or a case of mistaken identity remains debated, though most evidence points to the latter. It's believed that the original finders thought they had discovered something truly spectacular and took it to an amateur geologist who provided quote-unquote confirmation. It's speculated that after that point, they ended up taking it to someone more reputable who advised them it was just a plain old concretion. After that, it's speculated that the original finders didn't really want any more attention on the object. That said, it's impossible to know if the story was a deliberate fabrication or simply an extraordinary misunderstanding. One stormy night in 1113, a group of French monks arrived in the coastal town of Christchurch in Dorset, carrying a load of religious relics. If the legends are to be believed, this arrival would spark off the summoning of a 5-headed fire-breathing dragon. The monks sought shelter in the local monastery, but were turned away by a local abbot, who feared these relics would draw attention away from their local religious artifacts. Drenched and desperate, the monks found refuge with sympathetic townsfolk. The locals opened their home to host the weary travelers, even giving up their own beds. Grateful, the travelers prayed for their benefactors. By morning, as the story goes, their prayers had yielded a legitimate miracle. The crippled daughter of a poor herdsman who sheltered with them awoke with her foot magically healed and the ability to walk without pain. As the monks departed at dawn, they were suddenly overtaken by 2 riders shouting dire news. Christchurch was under attack by a dragon. Looking back, They saw a massive five-headed dragon flying in from the sea, belching sulphurous flames onto the town. The inferno it caused raged through Christchurch, but there was something otherworldly about this fire. The only structure that was on fire was the monastery that had refused the monks' hospitality to preserve their own business interests. The monks of the burning monastery tried to save their religious relics, but the dragon attacked and destroyed all the relics. Humbled and terrified, the once proud abbot knelt down and begged forgiveness for his lack of charity. Thus, the legend concludes with poetic justice, a clear moral that kindness and faith were rewarded, while greed and pride met a fiery fate. Though fantastical, the Christchurch Dragon saga appears in medieval writings, albeit in evolving forms. The earliest report comes from Guibert of Nogent, a monk who chronicled the 1113 incident soon afterward. He recounted that an English town the travelers visited was indeed engulfed in flames after they left, and that a monastery took most of the damage. However, he attributed the disaster to a lightning strike sent by heaven to punish sin, with no dragon in sight. Only later did the specific town of Christchurch and the dragon itself enter into the narrative. In the mid-12th century, Herman de Tournai rewrote the incident, naming the town as Christchurch and replacing the lightning bolt with a fearsome five-headed dragon. Like the lightning bolt, the dragon was clearly the instrument of God's wrath in the story. This dramatic embellishment caught on, with further details being added in, including the miracle involving the crippled daughter of the herdsman. Interestingly, authentic local records corroborate parts of the story's backdrop. In 1113, the monastery was led by a man who had been found to be appropriating church funds, which fits the legend's ungenerous priest. However, it omits any mention of a fire or rebuilding of the church then, suggesting no literal incident occurred. That said, the records indicate that the church had significant renovations, perhaps due to damage, beginning in 1094. One explanation for this medieval English mystery is that the origin of the tale is a generational game of telephone where the details became garbled over time. Under this theory, French monks did attend Christchurch around 1113 and found out about the monastery's ongoing leadership issues. Perhaps they saw the monastery in a state of disrepair, and someone informed them that this was a result of some form of divine punishment for sin. From there, the story quite literally grew wings, a tail, and 5 fire-breathing heads. Another theory suggests that a lightning bolt could have struck the monastery or town, sparking a fire. Medieval people, steeped in religious interpretation, might readily describe lightning's fire as a dragon's breath. Indeed, references to dragons in medieval chronicles weren't uncommon, indicating a genuine belief in the creatures around that time. Many historians view the dragon as a symbolic invention, perhaps not intended to be taken literally. The tale's structure, hospitality repaid with miracles, and arrogance punished by disaster, is a classic moral story. Under this theory, it's a lesson in Christian charity, ensuring that audiences understood the virtue of kindness and the perils of greed. Be kind and welcoming, and you'll receive heavenly rewards. Be greedy, and you'll beg God for forgiveness as literally everything burns around you. Others have put forward the idea that the event actually recalls a Viking raid. Under this theory, which suggests the event happened much earlier than documented, the 5-headed dragon was actually the arrival of multiple Viking ships. The evidence for this is entirely circumstantial and based on the fact that Viking longships often depicted serpents or dragons at the front of the ship and also raided England. In the middle of the 9th century, a Varangian Viking chieftain named Rurik is said to have been invited to rule over the restless towns of the Eastern Slavs. According to medieval chronicles, this event in the year 862 marked the birth of a new dynasty and the genesis of the polity that would eventually become the powerful Kievan Rus. For centuries, the tale of Rurik's arrival has been repeated as the founding legend of Russia. But was Rurik truly a historical person, or a figure of legend created to explain the origins of the first Russian state? The primary source for Rurik's story is the Russian Primary Chronicle, also called the Tale of Bygone Years, a history compiled by monks under Rurikid patronage in the early 12th century. This chronicle recounts that in the year 862, several East Slavic and Finnic tribes, tired of constant strife, decided to invite a wise foreign prince to rule over them. To ensure neutrality, they wanted a man from far away, who had no existing affiliations with the tribes, and wouldn't exhibit any inherent favoritism. The prince they summoned was Rurik, leader of a Norse tribe known as the Rus, who would give their name to the region and to the largest group of East Slavic people. According to the account, Rurik arrived with his brothers Cineas and Truvor and a large retinue, and the three divided authority among themselves. The oldest, Rurik, located himself at Novgorod, while the two others took over lesser towns in the region. Within a few years, Cineas and Truvor had both died, and Rurik consolidated their lands under his sole rule. Rurik's base of power was in the Novgorod region, near the Volkhov River. One variant of the chronicle tradition even claims that Rurik first settled at Staraya Ladoga, an important Viking trade settlement on Lake Ladoga, before moving to Novgorod. These details suggest that the chroniclers linked Rurik with known Viking enclaves of the time. Indeed, archaeological discoveries show that Staraya Ladoga had a strong Scandinavian presence by the 9th century, and perhaps even as early as the 8th century. Norse-style artifacts associated with Norse gods, and hoards of Persian silver coins have all been found there. These are proof that a Viking network was well established before Rurik's purported arrival. Such evidence makes it plausible that a Varangian leader like Rurik could have seized control of Ladoga and Novgorod in the mid-800s. The chronicle portrays Rurik's rule as legitimate and consensual. The tribes allegedly chose him to govern. Modern historians, however, approach this claim with skepticism. The primary chronicle was written over 2 centuries after Rurik's time, and had a political motive to legitimize the ruling dynasty of its author's era. It's likely that reality was messier, and perhaps Rurik was a warlord who took power by force, or arrived as a hired commander, and then usurped authority. The idea that the Slavs and Finns peacefully called a foreign prince may be partly a legend to justify why Norsemen found themselves ruling the region. That said, there are numerous examples of foreign princes being invited to rule regions in the medieval period, though these come from feudal societies rather than tribal ones. According to the chronicles, Rurik ruled in the north until his death, traditionally pinned in the year 879. After this, his kinsman Prince Oleg became regent for Rurik's young son Igor. Prince Oleg wielded substantial power and subsequently expanded the territory dramatically. In 882, Oleg led an expedition south, captured the city of Kiev from other Viking lords, and declared it the new capital of a united Varangian realm. This act joined the northern and southern centers and is often regarded as the formal beginning of the Kievan Rus' state. Oleg and later Igor, who reigned as Grand Prince from 912 to 945, thus cemented what Rurik had begun. They had successfully established a dynastic rule over a federation of East Slavic tribes stretching from Novgorod to Kiev. The dynasty that sprang from Rurik's line, the Rurikids, would continue to govern these lands for centuries. Rurik's descendants, through Igor and beyond, became the princes of Kiev and later the grand princes of Vladimir and Moscow, tracing their lineage back to the Varangian founder. This Rurikid dynasty remained in power until 1598, when the last Tsar of Rurik's bloodline died. While the main branch of the Rurikids died with Fyodor I, Vasily IV spent some years as a claimant to the Tsardom during the times of trouble. Rurik's story has figured prominently in the historic debate between Normanist and anti-Normanist schools of thought. The Normanist view holds that the founders of the early East Slavic states, Rurik and his followers, were Norsemen who imported their leadership and helped form the early state. The anti-Normanist perspective, on the other hand, downplays or denies the Varangians' role, insisting that the East Slavs' development didn't depend on outsiders. In earlier centuries, this debate often had nationalistic overtones, as some Russian historians were reluctant to acknowledge that a Viking from abroad could have founded the Russian state. Today, evidence strongly favors the Normanist position. Multidisciplinary research, including archaeology and linguistics, confirms a significant Scandinavian presence in the 9th century East Slavic lands. Most modern historians conclude that the Varangians were indeed Norsemen who became a ruling elite and gradually assimilated with Eastern Slavs over the following centuries. The Normanist theory is now mainstream, whereas modern anti-Normanist claims are generally regarded as historical revisionism, driven more by ideology than by evidence. In other words, while the exact degree of Norse influence can be debated, the mainstream scholarly consensus acknowledges a Scandinavian origin for Rurik and the early Rus's leadership. Even accepting the Norse contribution, historians continue to debate the historicity of Rurik himself. The chronicles are our only direct source on Rurik's life, and they mix factual events with legend. Some scholars have treated Rurik as an actual chief who really did rule Novgorod, while suspecting that the tales of his brothers, Cineas and Truvor, were mythical additions. Other scholars have argued that Rurik was a largely legendary figure, a convenient fiction to personify the establishment of Varangian rule. Under this theory, Vikings did establish rule in the region, but there was no individual named Rurik. The true founder of the Varangian states in the era were lost to time, and the later chroniclers simply invented tales which broadly conformed to what they knew of history. Some have even tried to equate Rurik with Rorik of Dorestad, a 9th century Viking documented in Western Europe. The theory that Rorik of Dorestad and Rurik of Novgorod were the same person is built on circumstantial but compelling evidence. The strongest argument comes from the chronological overlap. Rorik, a Danish Viking who ruled parts of Frisia under Frankish overlordship, is last mentioned in Western European records around 873. Around this same time, Rurik is said to have begun ruling in Novgorod, according to the primary chronicle, which places his arrival in 862. Rorik's sudden disappearance from Frankish sources and Rurik's sudden appearance in Eastern ones have led some to see a possible connection. Also, it's notable that the years are less than 10 years off from one another. This can be explained by the Western sources on Rurik being contemporary, while the primary chronicle came much later. The names themselves are also noteworthy, and Rorik and Rurik are considered variants of the same Old Norse name. Another clue lies in Rorik's known background. He had extensive experience as a ruler under the Carolingians, and would have been familiar with managing tribute, diplomacy, and warfare. These are the very skills Rurik is described as bringing to the fragmented Slavic and Finnic tribes in Eastern Europe. The primary chronicle claims local tribes invited Rurik and his kin to bring order. something a politically seasoned figure like Roerich could plausibly have done. Still, there are limitations, and the primary chronicle doesn't explicitly link Roerich to Novgorod or mention Frisia at all. Further, we generally like to view the Viking world as segmented, viewing what was going on in the Volga region and Eastern Europe as being separate from Western Europe. This is a view that some historians believe wouldn't have been adopted by Norse people themselves. Norse adventurers traveled long distances routinely. In this light, the idea that a Norseman could serve the Carolingians as a vassal and then subsequently establish a tribal kingdom in Eastern Europe isn't implausible. All that said, most historians view the Roerich-Rurik theory as interesting and speculative, but ultimately impossible to prove based on the present evidence. Further archaeological evidence, such as a find indicating some sort of link between Frisia and Novgorod, may enhance this possibility, depending on what the evidence is. In light of such perspectives, Rurik is best described as a semi-legendary founding figure, based on the evidence as it presently stands. The general consensus is that it's most likely there was a real Viking leader in the 9th century who established himself around Novgorod. While he may not have been named Rurik or done the exact things Rurik did, somebody did something extremely similar. In that sense, Rurik most certainly exists, even if he would be puzzled if you referred to him by that name. On a crisp November evening in 2002, St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, buzzed with the usual weekend energy. Joshua Guimond, a 20-year-old political science major with aspirations of law school and public office, joined friends for a poker game at a student residence. Joshua had been valedictorian and class president at his high school and co-captained the university's mock trial team. He was considered reliable and rarely missed obligations. At about 11:45 p.m., he left the party to use the bathroom, and then, for reasons which are unclear, started toward his dorm. It was a 3-minute walk that crossed a footbridge near Stumpf Lake. Witnesses later recalled seeing him on that bridge after midnight, yet he never arrived home, and he was never seen again. When Joshua failed to return to the card game, his friends just assumed he went home, but when he missed mock trial practice the next day, they realized something was wrong. His car, wallet, and glasses remained in his dorm room, and repeated calls went unanswered. Campus security and the Stearns County Sheriff's Office launched a search. Bloodhounds tracked his scent to the edge of Stumpf Lake, prompting fears that he had fallen into the water on his way back. Divers, boats, and sonar equipment scoured the lake, while volunteers combed nearby woods, but days of searching yielded nothing. National Guard members joined the effort, and his father watched anxiously from the shoreline. The water theory dominated early thinking on this case. The campus sits among several lakes, and 2 other college men in the same region vanished within days of Joshua, and both were later found in local bodies of water. For months, authorities returned to the lake, but no evidence surfaced. Attention turned to Joshua's computer, and it became clear that several days after he vanished, someone entered his dorm and ran a cleaning program on his dorm device. Unfortunately, this would lead to years of setbacks, and this data wouldn't be recovered for nearly half a decade. When investigators eventually recovered data, they discovered he had created multiple profiles on Yahoo Personals. Some accounts portrayed him as a woman and were used to chat with men, often in an explicit manner. This suggested to investigators he might have been exploring his identity and could have arranged a clandestine meeting. Detectives theorized that he may have left the party to meet someone and either willingly or under duress entered a vehicle at the bridge. Notably, while it was determined that cleaning software was used on his computer after his disappearance, it wasn't clear who used it. For reasons which are unclear to me, the initial investigators hadn't sealed his room or taken his computer into storage when he disappeared. I have to assume this was just due to pure ignorance of technology on the part of investigators who may have not fully understood the investigative power of data on a personal computer. A number of theories have been considered in this case, and many still think Joshua might have fallen into water. Bloodhounds led searchers to the lake's edge, and the campus landscape of ponds and wetlands supports the idea of a misstep on a dark path. But repeated dives and sonar sweeps found no remains, and investigators themselves eventually found that this was unlikely, given no evidence was ever found. Notably, Joshua's case is one that's generally brought up in discussions of the smiley face predator hypothesis. However, no hard evidence has ever been established to indicate that he was the victim of a serial perpetrator, and the entire smiley face theory remains unproven regardless. It's been more than 20 years after Joshua Guiman vanished, and his case appears to remain no closer to being resolved today than it was when he went missing. Personally, I think the investigators just completely botched this one when they failed to secure the dorm room and get that computer into an evidence locker as soon as he was reported missing. While some data was recovered, I have to question what wasn't recovered in that process, and what evidence potentially fell by the wayside over time. For instance, he was supposedly talking to all these men under this female assumed identity, but because the authorities didn't secure the evidence fast enough, this created a major issue. If they had Joshua's username in 2003, they could have gotten the records from Yahoo and figured out all the people he communicated with and interviewed them. This ability appears to have been lost due to this massive investigative misstep. A young man vanishes into thin air, his last known location being a storage unit in Lethbridge, Alberta in Canada. Days later, his truck is found torched more than 700 miles away near a remote hiking trail in the mountains of British Columbia. No footprints in the snow, no body, no reliable sightings, just a burned-out vehicle filled with items that shouldn't be there. This is the haunting story of Marshall Iwasa, a 26-year-old whose unexplained disappearance in late 2019 has left investigators and his family searching for answers. After years of hard physical work in construction and landscaping, Marshall enrolled at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology in Calgary to study computer programming. He had hoped to build a career that would allow him to earn more money than he was making. However, unknown to his family, he struggled academically, was placed on academic probation, and eventually withdrew from the program, a fact which he appears to have struggled with. On the evening of November 17, 2019, Marshall drove to Lethbridge to visit his mother. She asked him to help with a computer problem and invited him to stay the night. According to later reports, there was nothing unusual about his behavior, and he appeared to be his usual self. He declined the offer to stay because he wanted to pick up belongings from a storage unit he shared with his sister before returning to Calgary. He left his mom's house around 11 and headed toward the storage facility. Security logs and surveillance footage show that Marshall attempted to access the storage locker multiple times overnight. He eventually gained entry shortly after 6 on the 18th of November and spent more than 2 hours inside. At around 8:30, he left the facility, and this is the last confirmed sighting of him. Investigators later determined that no other individuals accessed the unit at the same time, and what he did inside the locker remains unknown. 6 days later, hikers exploring an isolated logging road near Pemberton, British Columbia, spotted a burned-out truck on an unplowed trail. The area is extremely remote, requiring a four-wheel drive vehicle and knowledge of backcountry conditions. It's not on any main route and can't readily be found on any apps or maps. The hikers were unable to call authorities until they reached cell service the following day. On November 25th, the authorities arrived at the scene and confirmed that the vehicle belonged to Marshall. His vehicle was approximately 14 hours from home, and no one was sure how it got there. Around the truck were numerous personal items: clothing, a backpack, a destroyed laptop, and 3 smashed cell phones. Curiously, there were gaming consoles and an expired passport that didn't belong to Marshall. More perplexing, key components such as the steering column and battery were missing. The fire originated inside the passenger cabin of the vehicle, according to the arson investigator hired by the family, leading to suspicions that it had been set deliberately. Investigators themselves haven't publicly released their own arson report, but they have not disputed the conclusion, at least not openly. From the beginning, the Lethbridge Police Service deemed the disappearance suspicious, but maintained that there was no credible or corroborating evidence to suggest foul play. Because the case remained a missing person investigation, rather than a criminal investigation, authorities didn't immediately collect potential evidence such as DNA or fingerprints. They also didn't gather surveillance footage from gas stations along the 700-mile route Marshall would have taken or issue a nationwide alert. This cautious approach frustrated the family, who argued that the burned truck, missing parts, and presence of unusual items should have triggered a criminal investigation. For their part, the authorities seemed to have suspected that he did it himself, hence why they didn't seem to conduct a thorough investigation. They weren't clear as to whether they believed he had ended himself, or if he had voluntarily started a new life, but it was clear they preferred one of these scenarios. And I swear, Canadian cops may give Japanese cops a run for their money when it comes to incompetence. And unlike Japanese cops, Canadian cops have a lot more crime to deal with, so I have no idea what their excuse is. Another theory suggests Marshall may have gotten lost and succumbed to the elements after his truck became stuck. The Pemberton backcountry is unforgiving with steep slopes, dense brush, and rapidly changing weather. An accident such as falling into a ravine or stream could conceal a body for years. However, several factors weaken this theory in my view. One investigator determined the truck fire was deliberate, making it unlikely Marshall accidentally set his vehicle ablaze before wandering off. After all, he was deep in the woods, and this would have essentially been the equivalent of burning your ships when you arrive on a new continent, which just sounds implausible. Personally, while I think it's impossible to completely dismiss this theory, I just don't understand why he would have burnt his truck. Many, including his family, believe the evidence points towards foul play. This theory suggests that Marshall was lured by someone after leaving the storage unit, driven to British Columbia by one or more individuals, and ultimately slain. Those who support this theory claim that several details support this view. For instance, the 14-hour journey from Lethbridge to Pemberton would have required at least 2 gas station stops, yet no activity appeared on Marshall's bank account. That said, he may have paid in cash, though his family said this wouldn't have been like him. Also, of course, if he had actually planned this all out, he may have taken along gas canisters with him. These canisters may have eventually been used to light his truck on fire as well, though that's just complete speculation on my part, and no canisters were even recovered. Personally, I think the truck being set on fire is the strongest indication that there may have been foul play at work here. That said, this would have required a tandem driver, since otherwise the perpetrators would have had no meaningful way to escape the deep backwoods area where the truck was found. Despite the suspicious circumstances, no motive or suspects have been identified. There's no evidence linking Marshall to any criminal elements or anyone who might have wanted to harm him. Unfortunately, the disappearance of Marshall Iwasa may never be solved, largely because investigators were slow to consider foul play. Early efforts focused on the possibility of an accident or voluntary disappearance, which delayed crucial forensic work and allowed potential evidence to be lost or contaminated. The burned truck should have triggered an immediate criminal investigation, Yet the scene was just treated as puzzling rather than suspicious. By the time authorities acknowledged foul play as plausible, too much time had passed. Personally, I think that if the authorities had gathered surveillance footage from the gas stations along the route in a timely manner, this wouldn't be an unsolved mystery. There's just too much evidence that points to the potential involvement of other parties, and that footage would have potentially cleared up whether he was alone or not while on the road. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and to tap the notification bell and click the share button and send it around to your friends and family. Also, just an extra emphasis on clicking the notification bell, because clicking this is the only way you're assured to see my new videos drop. I've had so many complaints lately from subscribers who say they aren't getting my new videos anymore, and clicking that bell is the only workaround as far as I know. On a mild afternoon in May 2003, families in the town of Kumatori in southern Osaka Prefecture were settling into their routines. The local elementary school had sent its fourth graders on a social studies field trip to the nearby Sewage Science Museum. 9-year-old Yuri Yoshikawa was on her way home. She was dressed in her white short-sleeved school shirt, a dark skirt, bright pink socks patterned with stars, and carrying a Sanrio backpack. She had left the sewage museum with 3 friends around 2:40 p.m. The girls walked together until they reached a traffic light on Nanayama Street, about 1 mile from Yuri's house, where they waved goodbye. A boy pedaling past on his bicycle saw Yuri alone a few minutes later on a quiet hillside road. He was sure it was Yuri because he lived in the same neighborhood, and while he wasn't one of her friends, he knew her fairly well. He exchanged a casual greeting and rode off, and with that, no one has seen Yuri since. When Yuri hadn't returned by 5 p.m., her older brother alerted their parents. The family canvassed the neighborhood, but by 7:30 they had to call police. Investigators initially treated the case as a kidnapping for profit and waited with the family for a ransom demand that never came. After the first crucial hours passed with no word, the Osaka Prefectural Police mobilized hundreds of officers and volunteers. Notably, this initial wait period has been highly controversial. According to the cops, they were worried that visible police activity could endanger Yuri if the kidnapper was holding her for ransom. Under this theory, Yuri may have been eliminated if the kidnapper thought the heat on him was getting too intense. That said, it's unclear why they believed this theory at all, and the only thing to support it is perhaps the fact that her father was a wealthy businessman. Witnesses reported hearing no screams or signs of a struggle, fueling speculation that Yuri may have been lured rather than snatched by force. In 2003, the area had few security cameras, and cars with dashboard cameras were extremely rare, so investigators had to rely on human memory. The investigation quickly went cold and fully stalled out until a decade later. In 2013, a woman came forward with a startling memory. On the day Yuri disappeared, she had been driving near the hillside road when she noticed a white car parked awkwardly at the roadside. As she slowed to pass, she glanced into the vehicle and saw a middle-aged man at the wheel and a young girl in the passenger seat wearing a white shirt. Over the years, 2 more people reported seeing a similar car that afternoon. Police eventually announced that the vehicle was likely a Toyota Crown from the late 1980s, and that they had quietly been investigating this model for years. The cops had known about this vehicle the entire time, and hadn't released this information to the public. Investigators traced about 900 such cars registered in southern Osaka and interviewed almost all of them. Yet none of the inquiries led to a breakthrough. The delay in releasing this clue provoked a ton of criticism because the police kept the sighting secret for 10 years. Even today, the police have not released the composite sketch drawn from witness descriptions, fearing that an inaccurate image could misdirect the public, again drawing criticism. Yuri's parents, Nagaki and Haruko Yoshikawa, have fought for their daughter's return in a way that attracted the wrong sort of attention from scammers. Nagaki Yoshikawa was an extremely successful businessman, and this fact didn't go unnoticed. The family's ordeal deepened in 2004 when a man and woman approached Nagaki claiming to be psychics who knew Yuri's whereabouts. They not only claimed that they had seen visions of her, but that she was alive and could rescue her. And to do this, they claimed they needed big heaping piles of cash to fuel all their needs while they focused on their quote-unquote psychic work. Over the next 4 years, they convinced the parents to transfer a total of roughly 70 million yen in exchange for vague updates about their daughter. To put this in context, adjusted for inflation, this is over $1 million. The psychics told the parents that the police didn't approve of their methods, and if they told them about it, they couldn't help them anymore. Believing they could be jeopardizing Yuri's safety, they didn't inform police of the psychic involvement. Eventually, the pair's demands drained the family's savings, and when they couldn't pay up anymore, the psychic said they had to stop working with the family. Only then did the parents confide in investigators what had happened, and they arrested the con artists in 2008 on fraud charges. There are a number of theories about what may have happened to Yuri, and the most straightforward one is that Yuri was abducted by a stranger. Early on, investigators considered that someone might have targeted the family for ransom, likely due to the wealth of the family. However, no ransom demand arrived, and the subsequent appearance of a suspicious white car with a middle-aged male driver suggests an opportunistic abduction. Another hypothesis is that Yuri was accidentally struck by a vehicle on the narrow hillside road. In this scenario, a driver panicked and hid her body rather than reporting the collision. Supporters of this idea point to the steep, winding roads around Nanayama and the absence of screams or evidence of a struggle. A rapid collision could have knocked Yuri unconscious, and she could have later perished. Investigators did consider a hit and run, though they were unable to find any evidence that it actually occurred. Perhaps the most bizarre possibility of all is that North Korean agents were involved in her abduction, and that she perhaps may still be alive. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, North Korea abducted several Japanese citizens. Some of those who were kidnapped were children, and they were brought to North Korea to train North Korean infiltrators to speak Japanese at a native level. These infiltrators were raised entirely in a Japanese cultural context, so that when they were eventually deployed to Japan, they would completely blend in. Under this theory, it's been speculated that Yuri was taken to be a friend for a North Korean child raised for this future role. However, it's been noted that by 2003, the program of abducting Japanese citizens had officially wrapped up, but of course, with North Korea, who really knows? The disappearance of Yuri Yoshikawa remains one of Japan's most haunting mysteries. More than 20 years on, the case is still open, and the Yoshikawa family continues to wait, hoping against all reason that their daughter may one day return to them. On the night of March 19, 1919, the city of New Orleans was alive with the sounds of music. It was St. Joseph's Day, a holiday of deep significance to the city's large Italian population, but the music that filled the humid air wasn't one of quiet reverence. From the grandest dance halls to the most humble houses, the raw, improvisational energy of jazz spilled out into the streets to ward off what they believed to be an otherworldly threat. Professional bands played to packed rooms, while families with amateur musicians gathered in their parlors, their instruments a shield against the darkness. This citywide concert was an act of collective exorcism. Just days earlier, the Times-Picayune newspaper had published a letter from a man who claimed to be the serial predator stalking their neighborhoods. He called himself the Axeman and let the readers know that he was a demon from the hottest pits of hell. This man, in the guise of a demonic entity, issued a bizarre ultimatum. At 15 minutes past midnight, he would once again pass through the city, but he would spare all those inside any home where a jazz band was in full swing. This surreal night, where a city's greatest cultural export became a talisman against its deepest fear, is the perfect entry point into the story of the Axemen of New Orleans. New Orleans of 1918 was a city on the edge, filled with various tensions. It was a major port still buzzing from its role in the global conflict that had engulfed the world, but also a place worn down by economic uncertainty and a far more prolific threat. Long before the first Axeman attack, a deadlier, invisible enemy had already laid siege to the city. The Spanish flu arrived in the fall of 1918, brought in on the very ships that were the city's lifeblood. The public health response was slow and ultimately ineffective, striking down the young and healthy with terrifying speed. This event created the ideal psychological conditions for a new kind of terror to take hold. The city was already traumatized by this virus that entered homes unannounced, leaving devastation in its wake. Further, public trust in authority had been eroded by what many saw as the failure of officials to contain this unseen entity. When the Axeman began his attacks, it felt like a second wave of a familiar nightmare. He too was an invisible threat who violated the sanctity of the home, and his own letter to the press even claimed he was an invisible stalker who struck in the night. Yet, amidst this atmosphere of extreme anxiety, New Orleans was also giving birth to something vibrant and new. In the late 19th century, a new kind of music was forming, and it was the perfect fusion of the African, European, and Caribbean traditions that permeated the city. This music, which we would come to know as jazz, would be the only thing that could soothe the soul of this beastly predator. And it's very important to keep this connection to jazz in mind, because the most compelling theory of who this unseen predator was turns pretty heavily on this form of music. The Axeman's story is inextricably linked to the story of Sicilian immigrants in New Orleans. Beginning in the late 19th century, a massive wave of Sicilians arrived in the city, fleeing poverty in their homeland for the promise of work on Louisiana's sugar and cotton plantations. New Orleans became a primary port of entry, and by the time of the Axeman attacks, its Italian-American population was second only to New York City. These immigrants established a vibrant community in the lower French Quarter, an area that soon became known as Little Palermo. Crucially, many did not remain laborers for long. Through incredible hardship and thrift, they followed a common trajectory from the plantation fields to entrepreneurship. They opened small businesses, most notably corner grocery stores. By 1920, Italian-owned businesses accounted for half of all grocery stores in the city, and they were a visible and vital part of every neighborhood. This rapid economic success, however, came at a price, and some theorize that individuals like the Axeman would target this group for attacks due to this success. The Axeman's spree began on May 23, 1918, and immediately established a chillingly consistent pattern. The perp would gain entry to his victims' homes, which were often connected to their grocery stores, by chiseling out a panel on a back door. He would then select a weapon from the premises, usually an axe, and attack his victims as they slept. Robbery was never the motive, and money and valuables were consistently left untouched. The first victims were Joseph and Catherine Maggio, who were found brutally eliminated in their apartment. Joseph's throat had been cut with a straight razor before both he and his wife were bludgeoned with an axe. Over the next year and a half, the attacks continued, each one adding to the city's growing panic. The terror reached a new peak in March 1919, when the perpetrator crossed the Mississippi River to the suburb of Gretna and attacked the Cortimiglia family. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia were gravely injured, and their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, was slain. The final string of attacks occurred between August and October 1919, ending with the brutal and fatal attack on a grocer named Mike Pepitone. And keep this victim in mind, because he's going to come up again shortly. And then, as mysteriously as it began, the reign of terror stopped, the Axeman having claimed as many as 17 victims in just under 2 years. The police investigation was, from the beginning, a catalog of failures that reflected the city's deepest social fractures. The New Orleans Police Department of the era was notoriously corrupt and lacked any modern investigative techniques whatsoever. Forensic science was in its infancy, and crime scenes were often poorly managed. In the Maggio case, for instance, the weapon was found on a neighbor's lawn only after an incomplete initial search of the home. The concept of a serial predator was also largely foreign to the police of New Orleans. Most investigators simply couldn't accept that one man could be behind these attacks, potentially with no motivation beyond the thrill of taking another life. However, interestingly, one investigator did go on the record saying that he believed that the Axeman was one single figure with a Jekyll and Hyde personality. Other potential motivations, such as prejudice towards the city's Italian community, were also ignored. The cops primarily focused on the potential that the attacks were a vendetta within the Italian community. Italians coming to America and bringing along vendettas from the old country was a popular narrative in the media at the time, and the investigators bought into it fully. Ultimately, against this backdrop, it's perhaps completely unsurprising that the phantom attacker was never caught. Over the century since the attacks, 3 main theories about the Axeman's identity have persisted. The most popular theory at the time was that the attacks were mafia-related, either vendettas or Black Hand extortion attempts gone wrong. And just by way of background, the Black Hand were extortion groups from Italy who targeted Italian and Italian-American communities. However, unlike the mafia, they were only very loosely organized in any meaningful sense. However, experts then and now have largely discounted this. The mafia used guns, not axes, and they didn't leave survivors, as the Axeman frequently did. That said, these Black Hand groups are potentially a more likely culprit, since unlike the mob, anyone could claim to be part of the Black Hand. It was simply a label some criminals used to make themselves much more intimidating to their potential victims of extortion. The second theory is that the Axeman was a lone, psychologically disturbed individual. He may have been motivated by his extreme Italophobia, or he may have seen them as a marginalized community that could be more easily targeted. Another variant of this theory draws on the evidence of the letter, and suggests that the Axeman may have been conducting sacrifices or occult rituals. However, the records from the crime scenes don't appear to show any direct evidence of occult involvement. Further yet, it's not even clear that the letter itself was sent by the Axeman himself. The third theory centers on a single compelling suspect, Joseph Mumphrey. Mumphrey was a known criminal who ran a blackmailing gang that targeted Italian business owners. The most damning evidence against him emerged years after the attacks had stopped. In 1921, the widow of the Axeman's final victim, Mike Pepitone, was living in Los Angeles. Mumphrey tracked her down and allegedly threatened to, quote, do what he did to her husband if she didn't pay him. She didn't feel like paying up, and happened to be armed at the time, so she started blasting. She later told police that she recognized Mumphrey as a man she had seen lurking near her home on the night of her husband's slaying. Notably, Mumphrey was also something of an entrepreneur and happened to be the quote-unquote manager of a number of local jazz bands. The letter to the newspaper forced households and establishments to book jazz bands, and sales of jazz sheet music went through the roof. Mumphrey, in essence, may have turned the art form of jazz itself into a disturbing element of a protection racket. While the evidence is entirely circumstantial and his guilt is still debated, the case for Joseph Mumphrey as the Axeman is ultimately quite strong. There are, of course, others who have speculated that there never really was a New Orleans Axeman, and that the entity itself was a creation of the media. However, what historians have agreed is most likely is that the media attempted to tie in additional victims of crime to sell more papers. After all, reporting on an Axeman attack was more likely to move a paper than a regular run-of-the-mill attack, so the financial incentive and motivation was there. Whatever the case, the Axeman was never caught, and his identity was never confirmed, leaving behind yet another occult scar on the disturbing and dark history of New Orleans. On a humid July day in 1998, the peace of Strasburg, Virginia was shattered by a crime that would haunt the Shenandoah Valley for decades. A young mother was stabbed in her apartment, and her 10-week-old daughter vanished without a trace. In 2025, the alleged perpetrator, Daniel Pompel, would be arrested. But despite this arrest, one massive question remains outstanding. On July 27, 1998, 20-year-old Silena Jo Dalton failed to show up for her shift at a local fast food restaurant. Worried, one of her co-workers went to her second-floor apartment on South Charles Street in Strasburg. The friend knew something was wrong when she saw Dalton's black convertible parked outside with the top down. Inside, she discovered Dalton's body on the living room couch. She had been stabbed repeatedly while sleeping and appeared to have been deceased for hours. Dalton's 10-week-old daughter, Allison, was nowhere to be found, and several baby bottles were missing. Investigators arrived quickly, launching a search for the infant and collecting evidence in what was now both a slaying and a suspected abduction. The medical examiner determined that Silena had been stabbed 5 times. Based on the condition of the body, investigators estimated that she had perished between 9:15 and 10:30 that morning, a relatively narrow window for the crime to have occurred. Neighbors later told police they had not heard screams, but one person reported seeing a man placing a baby into the passenger side of a truck around 9 o'clock. Another witness recalled hearing a disturbance that morning and seeing a man leaving the apartment with a bundle under his arm. This witness wasn't quite sure what the bundle was and couldn't say if it was a baby or just a jacket. At the time of her death, Silena Dalton was in the process of getting paternal DNA tests to establish her boyfriend, Daniel Pompel, as Allison's father. She was also pursuing child support payments against him. Pompel acknowledged visiting Silena that morning, and he claimed he knocked on the door and left when no one answered. He maintained that he had nothing to do with the attack or the disappearance. Early searches of his home yielded no evidence, and sources report that he was cooperative at the time. Silena's mother, who suddenly found herself raising her daughter's other child and caring for Silena's memory, was not content to sit idly by. In 2000, she filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Pompel seeking $1.5 million in damages. The purpose wasn't the money, but rather, she hoped the civil action would unearth new information or force Pompel to answer questions publicly. However, without hard evidence linking him to the crime, the suit was dismissed for lack of proof before it even got to the discovery stage where he could be questioned. Family and friends remained convinced of Pompel's involvement, but there was little more they could do. In the years that followed, The Dalton case faded from the headlines, and the case went cold. In 2017, investigators expressed hope that modern DNA techniques would uncover new leads. However, the technology just wasn't there at that point. Investigators carefully preserved evidence from the crime scene, including a red mechanic's rag found near Silena's body. At the time, they believed the rag may have been used to muffle her screams. In 2025, as part of a renewed cold case initiative supported by the Virginia Attorney General's Office and federal grants, police obtained a search warrant for Pompel's DNA. Pompel had refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample when investigators approached him a few years earlier. After executing the warrant, forensic analysts compared his DNA with the biological material found on the rag. Court documents allege that the rag contained both Silena's DNA and Pompel's DNA, supporting the theory that it was used during the commission of the crime. On September 27, 2025, the Virginia State Police announced the arrest of 56-year-old Daniel Pompel on a charge of first-degree slaying. He was taken into custody in Culpeper County, where he lived. According to court documents, the arrest was based primarily on the DNA link between Pompel and the red rag. Court documents suggest the rag was identical to red mechanic's rags found in Pompel's home, and that his biological evidence was all over the rag. Notably, despite his apparent cooperation in the investigation back in the 90s, the authorities have gone on the record saying that he never asked about his missing daughter. Many have interpreted this as cause for significant concern about her whereabouts, but for reasons that I'm about to get into, I think there's a glimmer of hope here. While the arrest marked a major development, many questions remain. Most importantly, Allison Dalton has not been found, and if she is still alive, she would be 27 years old today. Age progression images released in 2017 show a young woman with brown hair and eyes, reflecting the baby's features. Investigators continue to work under the assumption that the person who ended the life of her mom also abducted Allison. Since Pompel's arrest is for the slaying only, the abduction remains an open case. Genetic genealogy has the potential to be the tool that finally sheds light on what happened to Allison. While traditional DNA comparisons rely on direct matches to known individuals, genetic genealogy takes the process a step further by building family trees from partial genetic links. If investigators can recover a viable DNA sample from any item connected to Allison, it could be cross-referenced against vast genealogical databases. In this case, if Allison survived, it's almost certain that she was abandoned somewhere where she could be found and be subsequently adopted. Adoption complicates genetic genealogy because it often severs the paper trail between biological and legal families. Records may be sealed, altered, or inaccessible, making it harder to connect DNA matches to the correct lineage. As such, this approach would likely require her own DNA to be present in a database, since nobody who matches to her will know who she is. One reason I speculate that Allison could still be alive is the lack of any remains ever being found, despite extensive searches. Infants can be hidden or relocated much more easily than older children. If she was taken by someone, like for instance her father potentially, she may have been subsequently passed off and grown up without ever realizing her true origins. There have been numerous cases where stolen infants survive into adulthood under assumed identities, living what appear to be ordinary lives. For instance, there's a practice going back to the Middle Ages known as a baby box, where churches will offer a place to leave a baby anonymously. This is generally believed to be to keep the babies from being abandoned and succumbing to exposure. But first, let's discuss the motive for a second, because I also think this bolsters the possibility that Allison is alive. Police have suggested that financial pressure may have played a role as Silena sought child support, and Pompel expressed frustration at the prospect of paying. It's also possible that the attack stemmed from a confrontation over the paternity test. If Pompel did it, by abandoning Allison somewhere safe, he wouldn't have had to pay the support he so despised. Further yet, whoever took the baby also took baby bottles along with him, which indicates that the person in question intended to keep the infant alive. Notably, he could have sold the baby through a black market baby ring as well. At present, Pompel continues to maintain his innocence and await trial. If Pompel did it, and if Allison is still alive, it would appear that he has substantial leverage to cut a deal to solve her case as well. On a spring day in April 1982, farm workers near Manteca, California made a discovery that would haunt detectives for decades. Hidden among rows of almond trees lay a partial torso. Investigators determined the man was a white male in his early 20s, about 6 feet tall and weighing roughly 170 to 185 pounds. One of the few distinguishing features was a tattoo of a blue snakehead on his right wrist, and what was described as a grim reaper on his left forearm. And if you're one of those people who just listens, take a look at this tattoo and tell me what you think that looks like, because I'm not seeing the grim reaper at all here. Despite extensive efforts to match the remains to missing person reports using these details, no one came forward. For more than 40 years, he was known only as the San Joaquin John Doe, until a break in the case in September 2025 would give him his identity back. The state of the remains suggested the victim had been deceased for days or weeks, and the dismemberment pointed to obvious foul play. Detectives canvassed the region and checked jail and hospital records, but the case grew cold. Without a head or hands, standard identification techniques such as fingerprints and dental records were impossible. The tattoos, which investigators hoped would generate leads, were published in law enforcement bulletins and news stories, yet they yielded nothing. Because the victim's body was incomplete and also partially decomposed, determining how he died proved difficult. Investigators speculated he had been slain elsewhere and his torso dumped in the orchard. The scene itself offered few clues, and no clothing was recovered, and there were no personal items or vehicle tracks leading into the grove. Authorities from the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office canvassed local labor camps and homeless communities, yet no one remembered a young man with the distinctive tattoos. Notably, in the early 1980s, there was no centralized database for missing persons, and communication between agencies was slow. The case outlasted several generations of detectives, and aside from occasional queries when a new missing person report emerged, it languished on shelves of unsolved files. As regular viewers will know, cold case detectives across the United States have increasingly turned to forensic genetic genealogy to breathe new life into long-forgotten cases. In 2024, the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram, a laboratory which often comes up in these cases. They extracted DNA from the victim's remains and generated a comprehensive genomic profile. Because the victim's DNA was decades old and degraded, standard testing wouldn't have been sufficient to get a match. The high-resolution profile was then uploaded to genealogical databases to search for relatives. Genetic genealogists then built family trees from distant relatives who shared fragments of DNA with the unknown man. They worked backward through census records, obituaries, and public documents to find a branch that fit the profile, and eventually, they zeroed in on a family from Flint, Michigan. A living sister agreed to provide her DNA for comparison, and the match was conclusive. After 4 decades, this John Doe was given his name back and revealed to be Danny Jensen, born on July 8, 1954. Born in Michigan, he experienced tragedy early in life and when he was a child, his father and younger brother perished in a car crash. There isn't too much information out there about where his mother was, and she may not have been in the picture at all. He and his sister were placed with different foster families, and without a stable family network, Danny grew up as a ward of the state and bounced between foster homes and institutions. His sister later recalled that they lost contact when they were young and that she last saw him decades ago. As a young adult, Jensen drifted to California. According to the sheriff's office, he had minor interactions with law enforcement throughout Southern California. It's speculated that he may have been struggling with mental health issues, which unfortunately went untreated at the time. Notably, given his drifter lifestyle, he was never reported missing, and it's likely that his tenuous social links just assumed that he moved along to greener pastures. Identification is only the first step, and of course Danny's slaying remains unsolved. Detectives still don't know who eliminated him, why his body was subject to such brutality, or why this horrible act took place. Investigators hope that revealing his name will spark memories from anyone who knew him in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It's believed that he worked in agriculture and spent significant time in shelters, and the authorities are hoping that now that he has his name back, that someone will remember him. If you have any information regarding Danny Jensen, please contact the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office. Given that Danny's torso discovered in 1982 was missing his head, hands, and feet, it's quite possible that they were dumped separately. Investigators at the time may not have connected isolated remains found in nearby jurisdictions, because forensic techniques were primitive and databases weren't linked. If small fragments or bones matching the anatomical proportions or cut patterns surfaced later in other counties, they might have been cataloged under unrelated cases. Modern case linkage analysis could revisit skeletal remains or partial sets from cold case inventories within a certain radius of San Joaquin County. It's possible that if there were separate dump sites in different jurisdictions, there are different case files that could be linked up. One of these case files could potentially have further information that could be the one key piece of information needed to break the case. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe, and to hit the notification bell and click the share button and send it around to your friends and family. Your sharing of my videos keeps my channel growing and allows me to dedicate a significant amount of time to content creation. Also, don't forget to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill True Crime, for solved true crime cases. It was a cool autumn night in Arlington, Texas in 1987 when 43-year-old Patsy Wright, co-owner of the Great Southwest Wax Museum, picked up her telephone and dialed her sister. The Wright sisters were business partners as well as siblings, so a late-night call was unusual but not alarming. On this call, however, Patsy's voice quivered with fear. It was after 3 a.m, and she gasped that something was terribly wrong. She had taken a dose of NyQuil, her nighttime cold medicine, and suddenly felt as if she couldn't breathe. She took this medication routinely, and anyone who knew her well would have known this. Her sister Sally and brother-in-law Steve Horning rushed to her home, but by the time they arrived, Patsy lay limp on her bed. Steve Horning immediately tried to resuscitate her using a mouth-to-mouth technique, a fact which will be important in the analysis of this mystery. Paramedics tried frantically to revive her, yet her pulse was gone, and at 4:15 that morning, Patsy Wright was officially gone. Initially, her passing seemed like a tragic medical emergency, but a week later, laboratory tests revealed a horrifying truth. Someone had poisoned her NyQuil with nearly pure strychnine. Born Patricia Bolton in 1944, Patsy grew up in the affluent Park Cities district of Dallas, along with her younger sister Sally. Their father, Tom Bolton, was an eccentric oil man with a passion for history. After visiting Madame Tussauds Museum in London, he dreamed of creating a similar attraction devoted to Old West heroes and outlaws. He commissioned dozens of wax figures of Western icons like Wyatt Earp and Billy the Kid, and opened the Southwestern Historical Wax Museum in Dallas in 1963. Patsy and Sally worked summers there as teenagers, learning the wax museum business from the ground up. When the initial location began to decline, Tom moved the collection to Grand Prairie near Six Flags in Texas. Patsy joined the museum's public relations department in 1973, while Sally managed the office. When Tom passed in 1976, the sisters fought a bitter legal battle with their stepmother for control of the museum. They eventually prevailed and became co-owners of what would later be called the Great Southwest Wax Museum. Patsy married Bill Wright, a retail executive, in 1965. The marriage produced 2 children, Leslie and Wayne, and seemed comfortable, but the couple divorced amicably in 1980, and Bill later moved to Houston. While running the museum with her sister, Patsy pursued new interests, and she met a questionable individual who she would briefly marry, but I'll come back to him in a bit. She was a skilled equestrian and became passionate about horse competitions, spending much of her free time at ranches and horse shows. Despite their shared business, the relationship between Patsy and Sally grew increasingly complicated. Friends noted undercurrents of jealousy and frustration, and Sally grew envious of Patsy. Sally was the workhorse, while Patsy was out horsing around. Nonetheless, the sisters remained partners in the lucrative wax museum, which by the mid-1980s was valued at several $1 million. Each sister carried a $500,000 life insurance policy on the other, an arrangement intended to allow the survivor to buy out the other's share of the museum if one perished. This agreement would later become a point of contention during the investigation, though personally, I see it as a bit of a red herring. On Thursday, October 22, 1987, Patsy spent the evening at her home on Home Oak Drive in Arlington, Texas. She called friends and family, watched television, and prepared for bed. As was her habit, she took a small swig of NyQuil to help her sleep, a fact known only to her family and close friends. Around 3 a.m., she phoned her sister Sally and gasped that she had taken the medication and something felt wrong. Within minutes, she started experiencing violent convulsions, a hallmark of strychnine poisoning. Strychnine, a bitter white powder used mostly as a pesticide, works by blocking glycine receptors in the spinal cord, causing painful, involuntary muscle spasms. According to the CDC, symptoms usually begin within 15 to 60 minutes after ingestion. Victims remain conscious during seizures that are induced by the poison, and if a large dose is swallowed, respiratory failure can follow within 15 minutes of the onset of the seizures. That's precisely what happened to Patsy, and when Sally and her husband Steve arrived, they found her lying on her bed, gasping for breath. Paramedics were called but could not detect a pulse, and Patsy was pronounced deceased. Initially, medical examiners could find no cause of death. Only after a week did toxicology tests reveal large amounts of strychnine in her blood. Investigators examined her NyQuil bottle and discovered that the seal had been pierced, and the liquid laced with nearly pure strychnine powder. The poison used was a rare, highly pure form that is tightly controlled, and it's not available in common rodent poisons or over-the-counter products. The purity suggested a sophisticated supplier, and law enforcement quickly ruled out random product tampering, meaning that the attack was targeted. Detectives soon realized that only someone with intimate knowledge of Patsy's habits would know to poison her NyQuil. The burglar alarm on her house was turned off, suggesting she felt safe with whoever was there. There were 2 dinner plates on a table near her bed, which her brother-in-law Steve claimed to have moved. This implied she had likely eaten with someone before her collapse. However, paramedics didn't recall seeing the plates. This discrepancy over these plates would eventually be one of the factors that would cause the Eye of Sauron to fall upon Steve. From the start, detectives considered and cleared a series of suspects. Patsy's children, Leslie and Wayne, were questioned as a matter of routine, but passed polygraph tests and were found to have a close, loving relationship with their mother. Patsy's ex-husband, Bill Wright, also cooperated fully and passed a polygraph, showing no indication of involvement. Friends and other acquaintances were interviewed to reconstruct her last days. The authorities even considered the possibility that she may have done it herself, but there was simply no evidence to support this. Also, when people do this sort of thing, they just generally don't choose to intentionally go out in the most painful and horrific way imaginable. A number of other suspects were initially investigated but quickly ruled out as well, including the people she boarded her horses with and a chemical entrepreneur. This chemical tycoon had briefly dated Patsy and was also a big lover of horse culture, and would go on to dedicate a significant amount of time and resources to helping out investigators. As the investigation progressed, detectives increasingly focused on Patsy's brother-in-law, Steve Horning. Steve had married Sally in 1981, after meeting her through landscaping work at the museum. Although Patsy initially welcomed him into the family, their relationship soured. She considered him irresponsible, complaining that he squandered his wife's inheritance on speculative investments and lavish hunting trips. It seems like he was loading up on obvious pump-and-dump penny stocks trying to strike it rich. Or rather, trying to strike it richer, since marrying a successful wax museum heiress already made him very wealthy. Motive was a glaring issue, and under the sisters' buy-sell agreement, if one died, the surviving sister had to use the life insurance payout to purchase the other's shares of the museum. Steve, as Sally's husband, would then have a legal claim to part of the museum stock. Patsy had recently discussed changing that agreement to prevent Steve from obtaining control. She scheduled a meeting to revise the contract in early November 1987, and she died 2 weeks before the meeting, so the original agreement remained in force. But trust me when I say it, this wouldn't be the only major event involving money scheduled for 2 weeks after she perished, and the other event would make this matter look small. Investigators learned that if Sally predeceased her husband, Steve would own a controlling share of the museum, precisely what Patsy feared. However, despite these circumstances, the authorities more or less ended up ruling him out as a suspect. He completely cooperated with the investigation throughout, and perhaps most tellingly, he performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on Patsy. If he had been the one to have poisoned her with such an incredibly deadly chemical, it's highly unlikely he would have put his lips on hers at great risk to himself. And that brings me to the person I've been hinting at all along. Of all the figures orbiting Patsy's life, one of her ex-husbands, Bob Cox, cast the longest shadow. Bob was a Dallas businessman and high-stakes gambler who owned another wax museum, and from here we get into more Game of Thrones level intrigue in the high-stakes world of wax. He first met Patsy in 1981 when he offered to sell his struggling presidential wax museum. She made a low offer and he felt insulted, but as their deal was waning, their romantic interests were waxing, and Patsy was swept into his glittering high society life. In 1983 they married, but the relationship quickly deteriorated, and Bob ended up gambling with Patsy's money. She also found out that he had significant debts that he hid from her when they got married. In 1985, Bob's own unprofitable wax museum in Galveston mysteriously burned, and his insurance company accused him of arson, and he faced a civil trial. Patsy was a key witness for the insurer, and the trial was scheduled for early November 1987, less than 2 weeks after Patsy's death. If her testimony was to be believed, Bob would have been completely sunk, and he would have been out a substantial sum of money. While we can't say for certain what the outcome of the trial would have been, Bob Cox prevailed against the insurer and collected millions of dollars. Notably, he refused to fully cooperate with the investigators, at least according to those involved in the investigation. One of the indications of a lack of cooperation was his refusal to undergo a polygraph test, a fact that many say shouldn't impact his credibility. In yet another twist involving fire and wax, a calamity befell Patsy and Sally's museum less than a year after Patsy's death. On an early morning in September 1988, the Great Southwest Wax Museum caught fire and burned to the ground. Arson investigators concluded that the fire was intentionally set, but they couldn't determine who was responsible. Insurance covered part of the loss, and Sally Horning quickly rebuilt the attraction with new wax figures and a Ripley's Believe It or Not exhibit. The museum reopened the following year, but the destruction heightened speculation that someone was targeting the family. As investigators dug further, they found another eerie thread involving a potential poisoning linked to the wax museum. This involved Lori Williams, a 26-year-old receptionist at the museum who fell violently ill in 1984 and died a number of days later. Years after Patsy's slaying, a jail inmate told investigators she believed Lori had been poisoned. Of course, jailhouse snitches aren't exactly known for their accuracy in reporting, so the cops ended up digging deeper rather than just taking her word for it. Detectives examined Williams's medical records and found no evidence of strychnine poisoning or any sort of poisoning whatsoever. However, her body was never exhumed, and the case remains officially unresolved and hasn't ever been classified as foul play related. While the connection to Patsy's death is speculative, it adds to the atmosphere of intrigue that has grown around the Wax Museum saga. In the end, it remains unclear who did this to Patsy, and while I have my own speculations, the evidence, at least as publicly reported, just isn't there for me to make any definitive statements. That said, I'll say that while a lot of the evidence does seem to suggest Steve Horning's involvement, I personally don't believe he had anything to do with it. In my view, no person who had poisoned someone with such a lethal chemical would ever think of performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on that individual while awaiting paramedics. On a sweltering July afternoon in 1997, a San Antonio detective followed an anonymous tip for a second time and walked into one of the most macabre scenes in the city's history. Behind a modest one-story home on Forest Green Street lay a barbecue pit filled with charred bone fragments. Under a stack of discarded tires, police later unearthed more bones and a bag of flesh that had turned greasy, the result of decomposition in the heat. The fragments had been chopped so small that archaeologists would later spend 8 days sifting through the soil, ultimately collecting more than 200 pieces. Rumors soon spread that someone had used a wood chipper in the suburban yard, earning the property the grim nickname, the Bone Yard. The bones belonged to Monica Rizzo, a 44-year-old employee of the Texas Department of Human Resources. She had vanished weeks earlier, and the grisly discovery shocked even a city that was accustomed to serious crime. Friends described Monica as hardworking and devoted to her family, but by the spring of 1997, co-workers noticed troubling changes. She rapidly lost weight and often arrived at the office with bruises on her face and body. Concerned colleagues requested a welfare check in April, and when police visited, they saw bruises, though her and her husband denied anything was going on. Given this denial, the police had their doubts, but without evidence or cooperation, they couldn't take any further action. Whatever was actually going on secretly behind closed doors, Monica's relationship with Leonard was publicly deteriorating as well. They had been married for more than 2 decades, but their marriage was reportedly strained by financial worries. Monica had advised friends and family that they were in the process of trying to separate and they were sleeping in separate rooms. On May 5th, 1997, Monica walked out of her office without explanation. She left her purse behind on her desk and later called her supervisor to say she was ill and would return to work on May 19th. She never showed up at work again, and Leonard later told police she returned and remained at the house for several days before disappearing. However, curiously, he never filed a missing person report, and when asked why he hadn't reported her missing, he claimed he woke up one morning and she was simply gone. His explanation seemed casual about a spouse who had been with him for more than 20 years, and it would seem even more odd when he later claimed to be broken up over her being gone. A month after Monica vanished, on June 5th, an anonymous man phoned San Antonio police and told them that Monica's husband had eliminated her and buried her bones in the backyard. Officers rushed to the Rizzo home but found only what they thought were animal bones. It's unclear how thorough this investigation was at the time, which is odd, given that there was a missing woman and weird bones found. And trust me when I say it, I'll be repeating the phrase "that was odd" many times throughout this segment. Another phone call on July 5th changed everything. The same tipster told detectives to check under a pile of tires behind the Rizzo house. This time, detectives unearthed a collection of human bones, a skull fragment, and a bag of flesh. Archaeologists from the University of Texas at San Antonio spent 8 days excavating the property. They collected more than 200 bone fragments, many less than 3 inches long, and determined that many pieces had been chopped or sawed. Some fragments were charred, suggesting they had been burned in the barbecue pit. The bones were so small and greasy that archaeologists speculated they had been processed by a mechanical device such as a wood chipper or shredder. Investigators later explored whether Leonard had rented such equipment, but he denied ever using or operating a wood chipper. Inside the house, detectives found unsettling clues, and sections of drywall were broken or removed, exposing wood behind them. When he was questioned about the state of the house by the cops, they got an answer that I'll describe as a red flag. This man, who previously didn't even bother to report his wife missing, said he became so enraged by the fact she had been taken that he began smashing up the house. I'll just let that sink in for a quick second. From early on, suspicion fell on Leonard Rizzo for very obvious reasons. He was the last person known to have seen his wife alive, and he didn't report her missing. In interviews with police, Leonard made violent statements implying that if he did do anything, it would definitely have been a capital offense. He later walked these statements back, saying he was just angry about losing his wife, and decided to use dark sarcasm, which to my mind is an extremely odd statement regardless. Leonard maintained that he had never operated a wood chipper in his life, and despite canvassing the neighborhood, no one was sure if they had heard the sound of one. After all, wood chippers aren't the most quiet machines in the world, and if this is what happened, it would have taken some time. But that said, something like a wood chipper would have simply blended into the background noise of life. In 1999, the case took another dark turn when Leonard moved in with a girlfriend, Susan McDaniel. He brandished a knife at her, and he threatened to end her and then chop her up, but she escaped and called the cops. Leonard barricaded himself in the home, leading to a standoff with officers. He ended up attempting to go toe-to-toe with the officers surrounding his trailer, and he engaged them in a firefight. He survived, pleaded guilty to assault with a deadly weapon, and was somehow sentenced to only 2 years in prison for this act. How incredibly odd that someone who tried to slay a woman and also took shots at officers would only get 2 years in the big house. Investigators would later find out that the anonymous calls that led police to the Rizzo yard came from Robert Hakala, a longtime family friend. His account is chilling, and he recalled that in late May or early June, he visited the Rizzo home and spoke with Monica and Leonard. A few days later, he returned and smelled a strong odor like that of a dead animal. He saw a small dog playing with what looked like a human jawbone, and when he examined it, he noticed the lower front teeth overlapped, just as Monica's did. Hakala told police he believed Leonard had slain Monica and called the tip line anonymously because he feared retaliation. Some have questioned why he didn't alert police sooner or insist on a thorough search during the first call. All that said, the fear of Leonard Rizzo likely wasn't unjustified, given the level of violence we know he was capable of, just for the act he was convicted of. Despite all the evidence here, no one has ever been arrested for Monica's slaying, which strikes me as incredibly odd, and I feel like I've said that a bunch of times during this segment. But the whole investigation just makes absolutely no sense to me. This is, of course, an open and ongoing investigation, so there's always the possibility that the authorities have some evidence to suggest that Leonard couldn't have done the crime. Another thing I find odd is that Leonard would go through all the trouble of destroying Monica's remains if he was just going to leave further evidence on his property after the first visit. I mean, this guy had the cops come to his house looking for the remains of his wife, and they discovered bone at that time, and then a month later, they found her actual remains. Also, if he wasn't the guy to do it, it begs the question of how he never noticed the smell of rot on his property in the Texas summer. To me, it looks like Monica Rizzo's case is one of those ones that needs a substantial amount of attention on it for anything further to actually happen. The scene is set on the docks of Georgetown, South Carolina, on the final day of 1812. A 29-year-old woman, frail from chronic illness, and shattered by a grief so profound it had hollowed out her world, boards a small, swift schooner named the Patriot. This is Theodosia Burr Alston, daughter of the nation's disgraced third Vice President Aaron Burr and the then current First Lady of South Carolina. She's embarking on a desperate journey, a gamble against immense odds, through the blockaded waters of the Atlantic coast. Her destination is New York City, and her purpose is to see the one person who had always been the center of her universe, her father. This voyage was a perilous undertaking from its inception. The conflict with the British was raging, and ships patrolled the coast, forming a formidable wooden blockade. Her husband, South Carolina's Governor Joseph Alston, was bound by his duties and couldn't travel with her. The route itself would take her directly past Cape Hatteras, a notoriously dangerous stretch of coast already known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. On top of these external threats, Theodosia's own health was fragile, worn down by years of sickness and the recent devastating loss of her only child. Yet she insisted. The need to reunite with her father after a 5-year separation overrode all caution. The Patriot would sail out of Georgetown Harbor, catch the winter wind, and vanish from the pages of history. To understand the depth of the tragedy, one must first understand the woman at its center. Theodosia wasn't merely a historical footnote. She was a remarkable figure, a product of a revolutionary era and the singular, intense focus of a brilliant and controversial father. Theodosia's upbringing was an experiment in Enlightenment ideals. While other girls of her station were taught the genteel arts, Theodosia studied a rigorous curriculum of Latin, Greek, mathematics, and philosophy. Her mother, Theodosia Prevost, was herself an intellectual and patriot who hosted American officers at her home during the Revolution. When her mother perished in 1794, Theodosia was only 11, and the already intense bond with her father deepened. At just 14, she stepped into the role of hostess at Richmond Hill, Burr's stately New York estate. She presided over dinners with the nation's most powerful and influential men, including figures like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, astonishing them with her intellect and grace. She was, by many accounts, one of the best educated women in the young American Republic. In 1801, at the age of 18, Theodosia married Joseph Alston, a wealthy and politically ambitious planter from South Carolina. Their union was complex, and while their letters suggest a genuine affection, the marriage was also a strategic alliance for the perpetually cash-strapped Aaron Burr. In short, he saw the value in a connection to the nation's wealthy and aristocratic Southern gentry. Unfortunately, the move to South Carolina's humid, swampy climate proved detrimental to Theodosia's health. The birth of her only son, Aaron Burr Alston, was a difficult one in 1802, and left her with chronic, lifelong medical problems that would plague her for the rest of her short life. Theodosia's life was inextricably tied to the dramatic arc of her father's political career. She stood by him with unwavering loyalty through his darkest moments, including the infamous 1804 duel with Alexander Hamilton and his subsequent trial. She was his staunchest defender during his sensational 1807 trial for treason, where Burr was accused of plotting to create his own empire in the American West. After his acquittal, he fled to a self-imposed exile in Europe, and for years, Theodosia worked tirelessly to secure his return. The final devastating blow to her already fragile state came in June 1812, when her son perished due to malaria. The loss of her son, combined with her chronic illness, sent her into a deep depression and physical collapse. This personal apocalypse set the stage for her final act. When Aaron Burr finally returned to New York that same year, the reunion was no longer a desire, but a desperate existential need. The schooner chosen for the voyage, the Patriot, was no ordinary passenger vessel. It was a famously fast ship, originally built as a pilot boat, a class of vessel prized for its speed and agility. In 1812, it had been commissioned by the U.S. government as a privateer, a privately owned ship authorized to attack enemy vessels. For months, the Patriot had been preying on British shipping in the West Indies, and its hold was likely filled with a valuable cargo of plunder from these raids. For Theodosia's journey, the ship was deliberately disguised to avoid enemy attention. Its weapons were dismounted and stowed below deck, and its name was painted over. It was a wolf in sheep's clothing, its aggressive past hidden beneath a veneer of civilian transport. This disguise, intended as a safety measure, would have a profound consequence. Any wreckage that might have washed ashore would have been nearly impossible to identify, preventing a conclusive discovery and leaving the door wide open for speculation. Aware of the immense risks, Theodosia's family took what precautions they could. Governor Alston, leveraging his official position, provided the ship's captain with a formal letter addressed to the commander of the British fleet. The letter explained his wife's situation and requested, as a matter of gentlemanly gallantry, safe passage through the blockade should they be caught. If the British did capture the ship, this letter was supposed to ensure that they were free to loot the cargo in return for safe passage for the ship. On the other end, from New York, Aaron Burr arranged for a trusted friend, Dr. Timothy Green, to travel south and accompany his daughter on the voyage. Theodosia was also attended by her personal maid, whom she had a friendly relationship with. The Patriot set sail from Georgetown on New Year's Eve, 1812. The journey to New York, under normal conditions with a fast ship like the Patriot, was expected to take about 5 or 6 days. For 2 days, the voyage seems to have been uneventful. On January 2nd, 1813, the last known, verifiable contact with the ship occurred. As it sailed off the treacherous coast of Cape Hatteras, the Patriot was intercepted by a British warship. Governor Alston's letter worked precisely as intended, and after reviewing the document, the British commander waved the small schooner on its way. This moment marks the critical turning point, the last instant the Patriot and its passengers were ever confirmed to be seen alive. Later that very night, a violent winter gale swept through the area. The storm was so severe that it scattered the powerful, well-armed ships of the British fleet. The small, swift Patriot, having just been waved through the blockade, would have sailed directly into the clutches of the storm. After that night, no trace of the ship, its cargo, its crew, or its distinguished passenger was ever found. In the weeks and months that followed, as hope turned to despair, two competing narratives emerged to explain the silence from the sea. One was grounded in the grim probability of maritime disaster, and the other in the lurid and sensational world of piracy. The most logical and widely accepted explanation for the Patriot's disappearance is that it was simply overwhelmed by the forces of nature. This theory is supported by the strongest circumstantial evidence available. The confirmed last sighting of the ship off Cape Hatteras was followed immediately by a documented severe gale, powerful enough to disperse a naval fleet. The waters off North Carolina's Outer Banks were already infamous for their shifting shoals and violent weather. This was the conclusion reached by the two men who knew Theodosia best, her husband and her father. Both Joseph Alston and Aaron Burr, after frantic initial searches, came to believe she was lost at sea. Burr, a man of intense pragmatism, consistently dismissed the more sensational rumors of piracy. He stated with grim certainty that if his daughter were still alive, there was nothing in the world that could keep the two of them apart. Despite the logical explanation of the storm, a darker and more dramatic narrative quickly took hold. This theory claims that the Patriot, laden with privateering treasure, fell victim to foul play. The culprits varied in the telling. Sometimes they were pirates who captured the ship on the open sea. These land-based pirates were said to operate along the coast, luring ships onto the shoals on stormy nights with false lights. Once a vessel ran aground, the wreckers would swarm it, eliminating any survivors and plundering the cargo. For over half a century, the mystery of Theodosia's fate remained a tragic family story and a piece of maritime lore, with the storm theory as the most logical explanation. Then, in 1869, a strange discovery on the Outer Banks of North Carolina reignited the mystery and gave it a tangible, haunting focus that has kept it alive ever since. The story begins when a physician from Elizabeth City, Dr. William Poole, was called to treat an ailing, impoverished elderly woman. She resided in the remote community of Nag's Head. Having no money to pay for his services, she offered him her only valuable possession, a beautiful, professional oil portrait of a young woman. The painting's origin story was pure folklore. The most common version held that the woman's first husband had taken the portrait from a deserted ship that washed ashore around 1813. Dr. Poole, who was familiar with the legend of Theodosia's disappearance, became convinced that the elegant woman in the painting was her. He theorized that she had been carrying it as a gift for her father, a final memento of the daughter he hadn't seen in 5 years. When photographs of the portrait were shown to descendants of the Burr family, they agreed that the resemblance was striking. However, it was showed to others who knew her in life, and they found that it didn't look anything like her at all. The painting, now known as the Nag's Head Portrait, eventually found a home in Yale University's Lewis Walpole Library, where it remains a key artifact in this unsolved mystery. Whether this painting actually depicts Theodosia remains unclear, but personally, I think the resemblance is uncanny. If you're one of those people who just listens, I've put a confirmed portrait of Theodosia on the left, with the Nag's Head portrait on the right. Let me know if you think this depicts the same person or not. As for what happened to Theodosia herself, I tend to think the simplest explanation is also the correct one here. All evidence points to the ship simply being caught in a storm and being destroyed. Since the ship was deliberately not showing any identification, so as to run through the British blockade, this would have complicated any identification efforts later on. Notably, pirates operating along the Carolina coast in 1813 typically sought ransom when possible, and Theodosia was the daughter of Aaron Burr and the wife of a governor. It would have been immediately and readily apparent, just by her clothing and manner of speech, that at the very least she was a woman of wealth and means. Had she fallen into their hands, her survival would have been immensely more profitable than eliminating her. The absence of any efforts to exploit her social and political connections undermines the idea that pirates were responsible.